And the last thing I was going to mention before I got cut off in the last video is that with the Industrial Revolution, where there is, we're talking about all these new social classes and these social changes that happened. We were talking about lower class, middle class, working class, and then upper class with the captains of industry. But the last thing I cut off saying was there was new neighborhoods that were slum neighborhoods. There's because of the overcrowding of all the working class people lived in kind of one place near the factories. The urban areas in England, especially, but in other cities too, became very kind of like bad places to live in terms of just living conditions. So you had spread of poor drinking water, for example, cholera, which is a common disease, which is a disease spread through water, or is a water-based disease. So there was a overcrowding, poor plumbing, poor sewers, just all kinds of dirty, nasty conditions in very crowded areas. So this was not a good place to be if you were kind of in the lower class. So I'm going to stop you here. You can hit pause in a second. And all I want you to think about is, what is industrialization? What is it really? Not what the impacts of it are, but what it actually is. Okay, so hit pause and go ahead and do that. Okay, great. So if you thought about it, remember, industrialization is really the shift to a factory system method of production of goods. All right, it's when you're asked about changes or continuities or aspects of industrialization, remember, it's all about how work is done. So mechanization of labor, factory system, even the new goods that are created. But it's not about working conditions. It's not about social impacts. If a DBQ or a CCOT or compare contrast essay question asks you that, then you can write about that. But remember, industrialization at its core is about the work of mechanized labor, the shift from a factory to a factory system, technology, and the mechanization of labor. And the only other thing I forgot to mention earlier when we talked about the spread of industrialization to Japan, remember, Japan was really forced to industrialize by the United States. This was something called the Meiji Restoration, where Japan pretty much was forced by the United States and other Western powers to trade with them. And so Japan had to improve its military. They had to industrialize. They had to adopt Western-style government and a constitution and a factory system. Because if they were going to actually be relevant in the world, they saw that they had to do that. So that is another tidbit. All right, I'm going to shift to a new slide, which is imperialism. And so I want to root you in what imperialism is again. Imperialism has its influence from earlier colonization. So colonization refers to the 1500s when the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British sailed to the Americas, right at the same time of the Columbian Exchange, and they developed settler colonies. So that's where colonization gets its roots. Where imperialism is different than colonization is that, first of all, colonization or imperialism starts in the late 1800s and goes to the 1900s, and it ends really after World War II. So it's much later, and it's the Europeans are not directly controlling a place. They don't create settlements anymore in new places. They're still after raw materials, but what they do is set up businesses or trade partnerships, and they really engage in an economic imperialism with these new nations. And often these new places that they go, it's not the Americas anymore. It's Africa and Asia, specifically India and Southeast Asia, for the raw materials to fuel their factories. So remember, whoever is imperializing, they are an industrialized nation. That's the other piece about imperialism you have to understand. It's the industrialized nations who are looking for more raw materials for their factories. And I mentioned that earlier when we talked about industrialization. So there are raw goods that later in the 1800s and 1900s that factory systems need. So like oil, rubber, tin, copper, um, those kind of things are abundant in Africa and Asia.